Hello, I wanted to talk about the Unit 6 essay assignment, which I've graded almost in its entirety. I do have about 8 or 9 papers yet to grade, and I will be grading those later today. But I wanted to talk about this assignment because it's a very interesting question. When you look at the Southern economy in relation to the market economy of the North, you're talking about two incredibly different forms of economy. One industrializing and just beginning on its journey to becoming the most industrialized powerhouse in the world, which it would become by the end of the 19th century. And the other, a more feudal kind of society, heavily based on agriculture and on the profitability of cotton culture, which of course was based on slavery. Now, I've got a lot of really high grades on this assignment, a lot of A's on this assignment. And that's fantastic because this is not that easy an assignment to deal with, to try to situate the Southern economy within a larger American economy that was very different if you define the larger American economy as a market economy that was characterized most clearly in the industrializing, internal improvements laden section of the North. So you weren't supposed to describe the North in detail, but you had to make some comparisons between the Southern agricultural economy and the Northern economy. And for the most part, most people did a good job of using the primary sources to illustrate generalizations that focused on the relationship of the Southern economy to the market economy. That was what I was looking for. And that was very difficult to provide. It required a lot of thought. Now, what a lot of people did, and this was a bit of a problem, was that they just simply contrasted the Southern economy with the Northern economy. Well, that's easy to do because obviously one of them was getting the jump on the Industrial Revolution in the North with free labor. And free labor, when historians use the term free labor, they're referring to labor that is free to choose what jobs they want to do. Laborers are free to choose what jobs they intend to do if they can get it. Free labor doesn't mean that they don't cost anything. And sometimes students get tripped up on that because they assume that slaves are free labor because they have to labor for free. But that's not how we use the term free labor. Of course, slaves aren't free. They cost a lot of money. They were worth hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars in 19th century money. But they were not free to determine their own destiny. So we think of freedom in that way as historians. Freedom to determine what jobs you're going to do or not do. And in that sense, Northern labor was free labor. And Southern labor was primarily slave labor working in the cotton fields. And that was not free labor. That was enslaved labor. Okay. So actually, I didn't encounter that misuse of the term free labor very often in this particular section, although I have in other sections. The best papers try to explain how the Southern economy was integrated in the market economy, even the industrialized economy of the North. And the answer is fairly simple, although it often gets ignored because of the huge differences between a semi-feudal economy like the South's and the industrializing economy of the North. But obviously, one of the reasons why cotton was so profitable and so many slaves existed and were supplemented by more slaves is because there was an insatiable demand for Southern cotton in the Northern textile industries. And so the one economy was heavily integrated with the other. and the Southerners gained a lot of profit by selling their cotton to the northern textile industries. And the northern textile industries made a lot of profit from southern cotton because the finished goods that they made them a lot of money. So here we have a puzzle, and the puzzle has to do with the coming Civil War. A lot of times American students like you will say, well, there was a civil war because the southern economy was so different from the northern economy. But here we see how the southern economy helped the northern economy, and the northern economy helped the southern economy. So it's not clear at all that economic factors caused the Civil War. In spite of the differences of the two economies, they were extremely integrated. They were extremely interdependent upon each other. And you would expect, if history was guided by economics alone, you would expect that there would have been no tension whatsoever between North and South. Northern banks profited from the profits of King Cotton in the South. The profits from cotton were deposited in northern banks, and they made a lot of money off of the South's cotton culture. Most of the slaves who were imported before 1808 were imported by northern vessels, primarily from Rhode Island. So New England was making a lot of money off of the slave trade, as horrible as that was. So when we look at the causes of the Civil War, it's extremely interesting because there's this paradox that the North and the South were actually both profiting off of slavery, and of course the South was profiting off of the Industrial Revolution because those were the customers for their cotton exports. But not only that, the South did not have to develop banks because there were plenty of banks in the North for them to use for their economic transactions. So this has puzzled historians because they've said, well, given the integration of these two economies, the interdependence of these two economies, they were different, but they were both making money off of each other. How can you say that economics was one of the causes of the Civil War? I don't think you can. But many of you properly pointed out, by using primary sources that talked about the horrors of slavery, the miseries of slavery, that this touched the hearts of many people in the North. And so there were extremely emotional, romantic objections to slavery. And when I say romantic, I'm using the term in the classical sense that comes out of the French Revolution. Romanticism means that people were using their hearts to evaluate the world around them. And when they saw slavery and the miseries that slavery imposed on real people, especially when they read things like Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and they saw the attack on the slave family, the family was everything to Victorian Americans in the 19th century. They became emotionally aroused to oppose slavery. But that's not an economic factor. That's an emotional factor based on principles. And you could argue that the northern market economy was developing a preference for what in the 19th century was called liberalism. Now we're getting into another subject that is heavily dependent upon the meaning of words, just like free labor. Liberalism doesn't mean what it means when you listen to a politician today. liberalism in the 19th century referred to small government and free labor. In other words, small government allowing laborers to choose their line of work and have as much freedom as possible, and for speculators who had money to invest their money in whatever wealth-getting opportunities they wanted to try to make a profit from. That's what liberalism meant. It was something that came out of the French Revolution because it meant that the governments should be small and get out of the way so that people could be free to invest their money as they saw fit. But it also meant small government and greater power for people with property to vote. All right, well, obviously this kind of liberalism was widely being adopted in the North, but it was not being followed in the South. In the South, you had no liberal democracy. You had slavery, which was the opposite of liberalism. And people were really forced to align their occupations with the Southern economy and the needs of cotton culture. They really didn't have much freedom or say in the matter. So politically, liberalism was not flourishing in the South, but it was flourishing in the North as an ideology, as a set of ideas. And so you could argue that the struggle between liberalism that really begins with the French Revolution, not with the American Revolution, but with the French Revolution, was coming to America and being widely embraced in the North, but not the South. And that this struggle, this global struggle between liberalism and aristocracy was one of the causes of the Civil War. But again, that's a causation based on principles, based on heartfelt as well as rational principles, and not based on the economy. So you can see the complexity of all this, and the fact that no one has really understood or reached a conclusion about the causes of the Civil War. But most of you have done a good job of getting a start on that question.